Evie LaRoe here to present to you my book review. I had grand plans of comparing and contrasting several graphic novels together and really picking apart what is successful and what may be evasive to the traditional literacy learner, and how you can understand that through a multimodal or visual context. But as I was going through reading my first book, I realized there's just so much depth and so much that needs to be addressed. And so, with limited time, I decided that it was most important to give a review on this one book. And so, the book that I am reviewing is called Unflattening by Nick Cesanis. And what is inspiring and interesting, and why I chose to do a review on this book, is that this is his dissertation, and it is a graphic novel representation of a traditional dissertation. So I am going to walk you through each of the chapters, his thoughts and concepts. I have some excerpts from a couple of presentations that he has given, kind of addressing the concept and his influences, and really where he was going with this as an academic form of writing. So I hope you enjoy. Unflattening began as the first comic form dissertation at Columbia University, where Nick Cesanis completed a doctorate in education in 2014. It was published by Harvard University Press in 2015 and functions as an argument for visual thinking in teaching and learning. In 2016, the book received the further accolade of the American Publishers Award for Professional and Scholarly Excellence. Unlike a traditional dissertation, Unflattening is divided into 10 chapters. Each chapter expounds upon the process of visual thinking and how it relates to the physical world.
So, to talk about unflattening, I really want to start by telling you what I mean by flatness. And by flatness, I didn't mean something literal. I meant I meant patterns of thought, patterns of behavior that we're trapped in. A place where we sort of forget what might be and we're trapped in how it is. You know, we have lots and lots of options in life, but maybe they're already chosen for us. And that became a real burning question. You know, how do we get out of the narrowness of our thinking? And I think, and I'm in a school of education, I think a lot of what's going on in the institution of education is causing a kind of flatness. Education as recipe, education as a series of steps of things done to us rather than things explored. I don't think it's intentional, but I think it's the nature of this institution. And specifically, it's asking why does 12-point font, double-spaced, 1.5 by 1 by 1 by 1 margins, why is that what learning looks like? Why is that what counts as scholarship? It's not to say that's not good. It's not to say there's something wrong with it, but to say why is that the form that counts and everything else doesn't? And so maybe my biggest question became, you know, what are we failing to see? What are we missing when we're only allowing one way of thinking in our classrooms, in our scholarship? And what might we start to make visible when we bring in other ways of thinking? How do we get these ways of knowing into what our learning is? And so unflattening is a ridiculously simple idea. I almost get a little embarrassed when I explain it out loud. You all know this, but I don't think we think about it. I look through this eye and I look through this eye, and they're not telling me the same thing. And they have to get along. I have to get along so I don't bump into things. And they get along so that I can have a more dimensionalized view of the world. And I think that very simple idea of displacement, to move from your singular point of view to another point of view and keep those views connected and keep them speaking to each other, I think that is how we grow. And I think that's a big issue that we face today, is how do we take other perspectives alongside our own so that we can change them. I think our ways of making sense of the world through images are as old as we've been human. And I think that's something, when we think about what goes on in classrooms, you know, we're still okay with art up on the walls, but art as a way of figuring out our world, art as a vital literacy, that's been left out. And I think it's kind of a travesty, and something I hope, something I hope I can speak to. Because this is really very much one of the things I think that makes us human. And I think for me, it was, in your introduction, you said something about why not. And I think my approach to doing my dissertation in comics was was less an effort to be radical and more an effort to see why not. So we read left to right, top to bottom. But because it's visual, you can't help but see the whole thing at the same time, which means you're starting to make connections, whether you want to or not, from the lower right back up to the upper left. And that whole page is holding together in a way that changes it in some ways. And in fact, within any single panel, you're connecting, do you read the box first, or do you read where the marmot, I forget what it's Ricky Tikki Tavi. So that's a pretty interesting question. The fact that this sort of hierarchy of reading, which, if this was a novel, you would say, yes, I read this way. This is how you read, has been sort of broken up, and it's much more interconnected and all at once. So I think that idea that comics are both sequential and simultaneous is where they get really exciting, at least for me. I think about it in terms of how our brain works, and I think we have two kinds of awareness, and that is we're aware of the sequential moments. Like you've come to this talk, you've got something else you've got to do in an hour, you had something you did this morning, so you're experiencing time in a fairly linear fashion. But at the same time, you're also having things I've said that are making thoughts go off to the side here, or other thoughts about what you're going to do later in the day. So while we move through time in a somewhat linear fashion, or maybe we don't, but let's assume we do, we sort of wander in our thoughts in many directions at the same time. So I think that interlacing of sequential and simultaneous that comics do a really good job of capturing something about how things go on in our heads. So this is a page from a chapter on ruts or routine, and I was contrasting my wife's commute in Manhattan, which was different every day in different places and always changing, with the typical commute, which is we go out and we go back, we go out and we go back. And so instead of putting one here and the other here, in the background, the grid has the out and back. And so there's this sort of base thing that happens the whole time. But in the foreground, I'd noticed the sort of connection between Manhattan's shape and a falling leaf or a falling feather. And I was thinking about how her route was sort of a drift, or the Situationist Internationale's derive. She was sort of drifting through the city. And so I have the contrast of her drift, and I've mapped it out differently on all those, against that background. So the page is both, I guess, illustrating it, but it's also doing those things at the same time. And I think that's a really exciting potential for where comics can go. I think that question of changing the way we read, changing the direction you read, I mean, that's a pretty unusual question. When you read things, when do those moments happen? I think that's something we really can play with and do a lot of things about our thinking in comics. And so that becomes a question, is what do our thoughts look like? Before you put them out into some form, what do your thoughts look like in your head? And so the minute you make a mark on a piece of paper, this relationship engine that's going on all the time starts to see things in the drawing, starts to see things that you didn't anticipate. So I said it earlier, but I really do think my comics are smarter than I am because I have this partner that I work with. I start making marks and my visual system starts to interact with the things I made, and I start to have this conversation that teaches me a lot about where the work needs to go. So it's when I engage both the sort of I'm thinking about things, but I'm making them and seeing them. Your eyes are very powerful, and we don't, the visual system is very powerful. We don't know it because it works so automatically. So people ask me all the time, what do you think of first, words or pictures? And I say, yes. And it's not, it's funny, I think, but it's true because the page evolves from this play of having the words and having pictures and seeing how they connect in ways that I didn't anticipate. It's deciding that this is a page about the lousy name that comics have, and it's playing with Shakespeare's, and here I substitute rose for comics, by any other name would smell as sweet. I've decided at the beginning every panel is going to have something to do with a rose. And, I draw a juncture, or I draw this two forking branch, and that becomes the juncture. Did I think of the juncture first and think of the image, or the other way around? I don't even remember anymore. But each of those things is triggering the other. And the work, in some sense, I'm not a mystic at all, but I feel like when you trust that, when you start to let the pictures and words and spatial orientation of them, they start to teach you where to go. And sometimes I really felt like I just held on and let the work go where it needed to. And I was really happy. Harvard reproduced many of the early sketches in the back of the book. This is the very first sort of outline, which is exciting to me just because you can kind of see some of the things I anticipated, some of the things that didn't happen. But why I really like it is I think to people who don't draw or people who don't make music or whatever, that when you see finished work, it looks like magic. You walk through the gallery and like, oh my goodness, this is magic. I could never do that. But I think if we see the sort of mess that is the thinking, and that's the other important point, this isn't like a drawing of my thinking. This is my thinking. My work doesn't exist without this. I couldn't make it without having done this. And honestly, if I'd written the book and then drawn pictures to it, it would have been a completely different work. It had to be made this way. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing it the other way. It's just saying that it would be a different thing. But I think seeing the sort of the way we figure our way into the work is really important to make this something that other people can do. And I think we all can do it. The work taught me where to go and took me in directions that I didn't expect to go. And I think that's a really crucial point about saying why this is important. And I find across the board that the act of making changes how they think and changes where they go with their work. And it doesn't matter about the skills. I think what's important in that, and what's hopefully important out of my own work, is that incorporating other modes let us go places we need to go and let us discover things that we need to discover. So I think about it in terms of myself, in bringing these other modes, rather than sort of fitting pieces in, it opened spaces up, and that my research process became more journey, more sort of adventure of discovery than, you've got to fill in that last little brick that somebody's supposed to do. And I think as educators, as people, as students, as whatever we are, I think when we encourage those ways of learning to count, to be cultivated, I think it allows us to go in all kinds of directions that we need to go. And it's really something I hope as a society that we really embrace that and see the value of it. And I think that's very much what this institution is here to do. So with that.
So this last part of my review, I'd really like to talk about the connections between Unflattening and how it has influenced or encouraged or really just brought about, really has validated my sense of continuing with multimodal learning and kind of pressing the boundaries on what we can do and what is acceptable and how we can learn and provide this space for a dissertation. So my proposed research investigates inclusive multiliteracies and multimodal practices. And I'm still deciding on tossing around different types of research and methodologies, but essentially what I'm doing is I am developing and building and creating a board game. Teachers will engage in a creative meaning-making experience by playing a design-based board game to explore their understandings of gender equity in the classroom. The objective of the game is to gain equity and move up the board using multimodal strategies for scenarios presented in lesson plan cards and classroom management tasks. I'm currently in the back end of the publishing process of co-authoring a multimodal article. This whole process has been extremely eye-opening for me, particularly the part when our multimodal article was peer-reviewed. And the results we get back, no one's great with criticism, but it was really quite interesting, I think. I found that people have a very hard time understanding or viewing a multimodal experience. They look at it through a traditional literacy lens. And so this experience really has influenced me and kind of catered the direction of my dissertation, because I feel like I really need to work with teachers, but not just teachers. I also need to work with academics and showing them or teaching them or guiding them on how to actually respond and participate in this new direction of academia that we're going in, this multimodal approach. And you cannot look at a paper, you cannot look at a performance or presentation, you cannot look listen to music and incorporate it and rationalize it the same way you would from a completely literary lens, a traditional literary lens. And that's really what has inspired this board game, is that I not only am I creating something from a multimodal experience, but I'm asking teachers to develop their own thoughts through a multimodal experience, and at the same time that being a model for what they should be doing in their classroom. I've always been one to test boundaries, but it's extremely encouraging to know that I am certainly not the first in developing a non-traditional dissertation. Thank you for watching my review of Unflattening. I hope that you gained a lot of experiences and different ways of thinking as I did through this whole process. But I guess my ultimate takeaway that I'd like you to consider is that, as Susanna said, this is not a drawing of my thinking. This is my thinking. And I think that's such a powerful phrase. And that's really where I want to lead with when pursuing a non-traditional dissertation. Literacy comes in many different forms, and we all understand things differently. I'd like to think that pursuing a dissertation by building a board game could be looked at not as non-traditional, but experiential. I'd like to think that in my dissertation, both in application and execution of theory, that I could present, this is not an alternative way of learning a concept. This is simply just a way of learning. And in the end, like my board game, it's an equitable way of learning. Thank you.